Arabia David Ato. I'll be your moderator and moderator for the event. My able host, Dr. Christiana Idika from Frankfurt, Germany, is going to help us as a host for the event. Today's event was organized by the Conversational Society of Philosophy in its tradition to always mark the World Philosophy Day, which was 19th of November 2020. But today's event was instituted in the spirit of that day to have a discussion on the theme, the demise of discourse in African philosophy. Now, philosophy thrives with discourse, dialogue, conversations between philosophers, between concepts, ideas, and so on. And any philosophy that does not have this dialogue, these conversations, would probably not go very far. For us, we've noticed an apparent lack of discourse in the discipline in terms of discourse between philosophers and their ideas, between philosophers and certain issues or areas of philosophy like race, issues of gender, issues of same-sex, issues of the LGBTQ community. These issues have been ignored or largely ignored or seem to have been ignored in African philosophy. So we are here to discuss whether this assumption is true, and if it is true, what can be done to remedy the situation, and so on and so forth. So with me today, I have Ms. Dimpo Takane. Dimpo Takane is an assistant lecturer and a PhD candidate at the University of Johannesburg's philosophy department. She lectures in African philosophy. Her interest broadly lies in African philosophy, feminism, philosophy of race, ethics, and her own research covers themes on gender, feminism, and decolonization. Ms. Dimpo is a recipient of a few awards, including the South African Women in Science Master's Fellowship Award by the Department of Science and Technology, as well as UJ Faculty of Humanities Most Promising Young Teacher Award for 2020. Also with us is Dr. Richmond Kwesi. Dr. Richmond Kwesi has taught philosophy in South Africa and in Ghana, and is currently a lecturer in philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana. Dr. Kwesi's research focuses on African philosophy, especially African socio-political philosophy. And then we have Dr. Adeolu Oluwaseyi Oyekan, who holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Lagos and has taught philosophy at the Lagos State University since 2008. He is currently a Saatchi postdoc research fellow on identities and social cohesion in Africa at the Nelson Mandela University, Port Elizabeth. His research interests are in identity politics and conflict management, African political theory, post-colonial studies, and intercultural philosophy. I welcome all of you able panelists to this event, and I welcome all our guests who are participating as audience members. I would request that our audience also participate in this discussion by asking questions to the speakers, making comments and so on. And I also enjoin the panelists to also have a sort of dialogue, a conversation with fellow panelists. So to start, I would want to ask Ms. Dimpo Takane, why issues of race, gender, and sexual orientation have become almost near taboo topics in African philosophy, and why African philosophers seem or appear unwilling to address issues related to the above topics. Ms. Dimpo.
I think much of my talk will basically, try to address that particular issue, which I think stems particularly from a very brutal history of colonialism. There are a few other factors that I identify, but I think perhaps I should just rather get into it. Let me see if I can share my screen, because I will be projecting slides. Let's see. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can. I can.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Let me just, okay. So I have titled my talk, African Philosophy and the Absence of a Sexuality Discourse. And this just basically follows from a very long history of the absence of a discourse in sexuality and gender, particularly in African philosophy. So this is the outline, and I'm just hoping to talk very briefly on these three topics. So just a little bit on the history of African philosophy, or just in general, the conceptualization of African philosophy. Talk briefly about a dismissed discourse of on sexuality, and then briefly on African feminisms, and what also could be considered a discourse on gender and sexuality. So, when we look at African philosophy, it's often considered or even very generally speaking, African literature is considered both a male-dominated and a male-centered kind of discourse. I mean, when you read the work of Du Toit and Oyewumi, Du Toit talks about how professional philosophy is overwhelmingly male-dominated, and Oyewumi talks about, the history of a colonized, which has often been written from the male point of view. So there seems to be a weakness, on the link between African feminism or a discourse on gender and sexuality and African philosophy. And this could just be seen also vice versa. So it could also be seen as, the link or relationship between philosophy and the discourse on gender and sexuality. So the concerning questions really arise here on whether a discourse Africans, and if it does or it did, how come did they become so dismissive of the discourse of sexuality? So I think that the problem can actually be attributed to four things. And this is, the issue of a male-centered history of colonialism, the issue of the power of heteronormativity, the issue of language. I mean, when we talk about language, we're looking at translation, transposition, conceptualization of certain terms, words, and understanding of certain terms from or within an African context. And then there's a very interesting issue of justifying the existence of African philosophy. And I think for the longest time, African philosophers have been engaged in this project of justifying the existence of African philosophy so much that they ended up neglecting, this discourse on gender and sexuality. So, when we talk about sexuality as a colonial project, firstly, the understanding or general, conceptualization of colonialism simply is understood as, organization, arrangement taken from Mudimbe's 1988 publication. And we often talk about colonialism as a manly project. I mean, Oyewumi in her 1997 book, she talks about how the colonizer and the colonized are often presumed to be male. So there seems to be a neglect or an absence of the female figure in this history or conceptualization of colonization. When you read Fanon, this is just taken directly from him, and I quote, he argues that, well, he makes this argument that the look that the native turns on the settler's town is a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams of possession, all manner of possession, to sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed, and his wife, if possible. The colonized man is an envious man. So from this, you can take that it seems again, that this talk of a colonized and the colonizer seems to be, often taken or read from a very manly or male perspective. And from this, I think we can see not two, but actually four distinct and hierarchical categories of the colonizer and the native, if we take into account the gender factor or the issue of gender. So beginning at the top is the European men, and secondly, European women, and then you have native or African men, and then technically often you have the other, and this is often really considered as the African woman. So talking about the power of heteronormativity, and this is mainly just, a summary of, just the issues that relates to gender and sexuality around African philosophy and African literature. So here, I want us to look at the relationship between racism and Black sexuality. And this relationship, again, can be traced back to the colonial project. I mean, Patricia Hill Collins talks about the white fear of Black sexuality. And she thinks that this is what has been a very basic ingredient of, or what used to drive racism during slavery and colonialism. So we look at the colonial regimes. These were very much manipulated ideas which were used to maintain unjust power relations in society during colonialism, during the time of slavery, and even post, independence. So when you look at the literature on race and sexuality, it assumes that sexuality means heterosexuality, and which often ignores, the relationship between racism and heterosexism. So in ignoring the fact that these two concepts actually influence one another. And what I want to point out here is that racism and heterosexism actually share a common set of practices that are designed to discipline the population into accepting the status quo. And unfortunately, when ideologies that defend racism and heterosexism become taken for granted, and appear to be natural and inevitable, they actually become very hegemonic. And, these are some of the ideologies that I think to some extent can be argued have been transferred into, post-colonial African contexts. So I want to quickly talk about Black silence. And I think this is also another contributing factor to the neglect of, a discourse on gender and sexuality. And this also very much relates to this idea of heteronormativity. So I want us to look at race and sex relationship within racial boundaries. And I actually found this to be very interesting because there seems to be a discouraged talk and an analysis on topics and issues relating to sex and gender. And much of this literature on Black silence can actually be found within Black American feminism. Oftentimes when, Black or even African women start talking about or questioning, issues of gender, of sexuality, of gender oppression, they are asked questions like, why does this one remain so difficult? I mean, we have a battle of racism, of colonialism that we are fighting, and here she comes talking about, gender oppression and all of that. So Paula Giddings identified this as the last taboo, and she thinks that this taboo is actually of disclosing not only gender, but a sexual discourse which is unmediated by the question of racism. And what I found interesting, let me just read directly this quote, which I found in Patricia Hill Collins' book on Black feminism. She argues here that to talk of white racist constructions of Black women's sexuality is actually acceptable, but developing analysis of sexuality that implicate Black men is not. It violates norms of racial solidarity that counsel Black women always to put our own needs second. Even within these racial boundaries, some topics are more acceptable than others. White men's rape of Black women during slavery can be discussed, whereas Black men's rape of Black women today cannot. So rape, incest, misogyny in Black cultural practices and other painful topics that might implicate Black men remain taboo. So this is really unfortunate because it means Black or African women find themselves caught up between, the discourse on gender and a lot what she calls loyalty to race. We're actually fighting the battle of colonialism, of racism, and often enough sacrificing, issues that they themselves are actually are facing. And this is a silence that exists both within a social and intellectual space. So in social spaces, when Black women talk about, even from back in history, when they start talking about the violences that they experience within their own private spaces, it's often read as ratting out Black men. So they often find themselves caught up in a situation where they often need to be loyal to the movement, the Black movement, the African revolutionary movement, and often enough neglecting their own experiences. So briefly, I will talk about what Barbara Smith calls the Black woman's heterosexual privilege. And she thinks that this heterosexual privilege is usually the only privilege that Black women have. So unfortunately, when we talk about heteronormativity, and the only time that we talk about sexuality, within African philosophy or in an African literature context, it often comes across as heteronormativity. And she thinks that none of these Black women have racial or sexual privilege. Almost none of us have class privilege. Maintaining straightness seems to be the only resort for African or Black women. So unfortunately, again, it talks the issue of being caught up, in the situation, in the dichotomy of gender and race and these loyalties that African women or Black women seems to battle with. So just to close off, and let me just put these up quickly because my time is just about up. So I just wanted to point out here that, all these issues that I raised here are actually issues that validates the necessity of a scholarship on gender and sexuality. It suggests that a lot has to be done within and from a position of within and from a position of an external kind of analysis of what comes or what we have inherited from a colonial kind of history. So as much as there's some discourse that is developing now on different kinds of African feminisms, I think these also need to kind of be very cautious and of these histories, of these positionalities of Black and African women, and really taking, this project of gender and sexuality very important. In gender talk, there are very important questions that I think African philosophy needs to kind of emulate. And these are 3 questions that were asked in their 2000, Gender Talk publication. And these are questions that we need to be asking, like what would a vision of Black community transformation look like if we start taking gender to be more central into our analytic framework? And what would it mean if we are to make more visible and to engage in more systematic analysis of these convergences of race and gender? And how do we even begin conceptualizing these loyalties of race more differently? How is it that as an African woman, I find myself in a position where I actually need to be loyal to my race, but also loyal to my positionality, my situatedness, and the histories and struggles that I face in this time and space. Anna Cooper identified this as an urgency in 1892, and it's really unfortunate that we find ourselves in this, 2020, still talking about the same urgency too. And she calls it the urgency of analyzing our past failures and achievements, our present difficulties and our embarrassments, and our mingles and hopes and futures for the future. So we really need to pause for introspection, for retrospection, and for prospection, in conceptualizing a future of an African philosophy that actually speaks to, the current lived realities of African women, or conceptualizing these notions of gender and sexuality. So whilst we, engage ourselves in the project of decolonizing, we need not neglect the importance of, a discourse on gender and sexuality, because that would actually make a huge difference in the discourse of African philosophy in its totality. So yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dimpo, for that very interesting and short talk. You said something very interesting that caught my attention. And I'll just quickly ask you this question before I move on to Dr. Richmond. The analysis that implicates Black men, like you said, it seems like we want to avoid that. We usually like to avoid that. Coupled with the male-dominated arena that is African philosophy, does this account for do you think it accounts for the deafening silence that we have when it comes to issues of gender and feminism in African philosophy? And do you also feel that it is the case that Black men feel vulnerable to attack, and that is why they decide not to engage in the discourse of feminism and gender equality and all that? Do you think this is the case?
I mean, to some extent, I agree. I think this could be seen in two ways. So one, we have an issue of patriarchy, unfortunately, that we're dealing with. And where at this point, with the idea that African philosophy has been a male-centered and a male-dominated kind of discourse, it assumes that the philosophy that is done, the African philosophy that is done would kind of push a very male-centered and male-dominated agenda. And that is not to say, I mean, there's an issue of positionality and situatedness to some extent, arguing that, it's not, you cannot expect African men to understand the positionality of African women. So the idea is that African women should also be given the space. For the longest time, philosophy has been considered a white man's project, right? And gradually, African men started kind of, entering the field, but more entering the field from a very male-centered kind of position, where they kind of engaged themselves with trying to argue for the validation of an African philosophy, the existence of an African philosophy, neglecting all these other issues. And I think I've also had this problem for some time with African philosophy, that I think the project of arguing for the existence and not for the existence of African philosophy has really been exhausted. And we need to start engaging with real issues that affect African people, and coming up with philosophies that speaks to the real and practical, or that addresses the real and practical issues that African people are facing. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dimpo. Thank you very much for that very interesting response. Dr. Richmond, I have a question for you, and I hope this introduces, helps us introduce your talk. So there appears to be like a seeming unwillingness.
Sorry? I'm not sure if, I'm sorry to cut you, but if we can speak to some of the issues that Dimpo has.
Yeah, we'll.
So that before,
I don't know if I
get back to, we just want to have the discussion with
every. Just come straight to my office now.
Sorry, so you can go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, like I was saying, so I want everyone to have their first word, and then we'll really go into the questions and answer session. Yeah, okay. So Dr. Richmond, there appears to be a seeming unwillingness for some African philosophers to engage themselves and their ideas, especially in constructive ways. Take, for instance, the example of Ifeanyi Menkiti, who avoided citing Kwame Gyekye in his 2004 chapter on the normative conception of personhood, even though that chapter was seemed to be inspired by Kwame Gyekye's rejoinder in his 1984 essay. And of course, D.A. Masolo, who did not cite Menkiti and did not even include him or his work on the list of readings in an article he titled Western and African Communitarianism, a comparison. So do you think that there is this unwillingness for African philosophers to engage themselves? Do you think this is true? And if this problem exists, how do we get around it? And if it doesn't exist, how do we explain like the examples I've given above?
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be here and to join this discussion. So I don't have a fancy presentation like Dimple, but my understanding is that this is supposed to be a discourse. So I hope that there'll be more, it will be more of a discursive discussion or panel rather than giving a presentation on that. So the first thing I want to note before I delve into answer that question is that, I mean, so yes, analysis can be very interpretive, and it could be that people can give their own perspective from a particular point of view or a particular standpoint. And so you might want to characterize a few things as leading to the conclusion that there is a demise of discussion or a demise of discourse. So the first thing to note is that once we are here in the panel discussion, that's in itself is tells something. So there's some sort of critical engagement with the project of African philosophy and for contemporary discussions on African philosophy. So if there was a demise, we probably may not have this opportunity to have a discussion. So having a discussion and even having the whole point of a UNESCO World Philosophy Day speaks to the value of philosophy and to the value of African philosophy. So I think I want us to interrogate that theme that there is some sort of a demise. When there is a demise, it presupposes that there was some sort of lively engagement before it got dead. So we can ask who killed that kind of discussion, and how do we resurrect it? So for me, I'm not sure if there is that demise, and I'm not sure whether the examples that we're citing are actually peculiar to African philosophy, or whether they are even pervasive. So one criteria is whether it's pervasive and whether it is something that we can actually see within the kind of critical discourse that goes on in African philosophy. That I don't think is pervasive. What we have will be particular instances where we see that kind of lack of engagement. And I'm not sure we can give a psychological explanation to that sort of unwillingness on the part of discussants to engage in that. Also because, if we look at our polity and the fact that, traditionally our fathers will sit under the trees and engage in discussions and all of that. That urge to discuss, that urge to engage has always been with us. So I wouldn't want to say that there is that kind of demise or that kind of unwillingness to engage in discussions. But I also want to grant that, yes, there are all these instances that we have cited to show that there wasn't that kind of critical engagement in the ideas and discourses that people put forward. if we grant that, I want to suggest that that kind of lack of discussion has been with what I want to say is the first generation and possibly the second generation of African philosophers. So yes, it could be true of Masolo and Menkiti and JJ and Redu. But I want to suggest that that is actually, or that could be something that is characteristic of that first generation of African philosophers who were engaged in the project of defending the existing philosophers. I mean, the young ones like us. Do we have that urge not to engage in discussions? And I want to think that for us contemporary African philosophers, for us young ones, it's going to be a challenge for us. How do we build that network and trying to engage in the ideas and philosophies that our own colleagues put forward? And the engagement need not only be engaging with our own African philosophers, but engaging with other traditions as African philosophy. So African philosophy, engaging with the issues on Africa with Africans or with those who are engaged in African philosophy, but also engaging with other traditions, which are also not traditionally supposed to be African, and we're not necessarily part of African philosophy. So I want to grant that yes, there could be that kind of assessment. And again, from the standpoint or from a point of view, we might think that there was some sort of lack of engagement rather than a demise. But I want to say that even when we grant that, it is still a challenge for us contemporary African philosophers, for us young ones to see, for our generation, how are we engaging in the discourses? How are we engaging in the propositions that we put forward? And the reason why I want to say it is, or we can't generalize and say there has been a demise of discourse, because I understand discourse to mean a way of critical engagement, as Professor Las will say, it's a way of, a normative way of giving and asking for reasons. So discourse involves argumentation. And argumentation involves the fact that you put forward a proposal, you put forward an assertion, and then there is going to be the inferences that we can draw from that assertion. And of course, this brings in a lot of logic and sort of theoretical underpinnings to the kind of engagements that we have. So, so long as there is some sort of argumentation, there is some sort of drawing inferences, there is some sort of engagement, critical discussions of some issues relating to African philosophy, I want to suggest that rather than it being a demise, maybe there isn't that kind of sensitivity towards critically engaging with the ideas that our colleagues put forward. But on the whole, I think that people engage with others, other people's ideas, except that it's not really on a large scale and it's not really based on contemporary philosophers. So we have a lot of us engaged in ideas by Redu, JJ, Menkiti, and there's a lot of publications on, a response to Menkiti's idea of the person, right? JJ's concept of a personhood, Redu's concept of whatever. There's a lot of publications on that, and so it seems like we're always going back to the kind of that initial debates regarding African philosophy, where they were more interested in the concept of a person, the concept of the community and personhood and all of that. What I think contemporary African philosophers have not broken that jinx is that we keep going back to the same issues that were being addressed by these early first generations. And we need to think about, ways of couching some of these issues in contemporary modern terms, or using contemporary analytical tools in analyzing not only the issues that we're engaged with, but some of the issues, including gender and others that Dimple pointed about. So I have more to say, but I just to respond to that particular question that you raised.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond. And in fact, your last point leans into the question I have for Dr. Oyekan. So in African philosophy, like Dr. Richmond says, there's an ample discussion about past traditional African values, discussions about the philosophies of African philosophers from the older generation, people like Placid Tempels, Menkiti, Wiredu, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to seemingly contemporary ideas or novel contemporary ideas, which of course are at this moment a bit too few, African philosophers do not always engage with these ideas, and at least contemporary African philosophers. And when they do, they often seem to be the constructive engagement. So Dr. Yukon, what are your thoughts about the seeming or apparent willingness to discuss past philosophical values or previous philosophical values and not discuss contemporary ideas in African philosophy?
Thank you very much. I got drafted into this very, very late, but it's a very pleasant one. I'm happy to be here to share this panel with others and also learn from diverse perspectives on the state of African philosophy. When I first saw this the call for this webinar, the invite, I was hoping to just be a participant, but my immediate reaction was, oh, this is a very timely discussion that we actually need to have. And I want to start from where Dipo left off. I believe that the way and manner in which African philosophy has progressed has a lot to do with its history. The fact that we started out by trying to reject and then rebuff Eurocentric attempts to portray Africans as people who are incapable of rational thought, people who lack the cognitive capacity to understand and interpret the world in which they live. And so you will see that a whole lot of literature that characterized the beginning of African philosophy were reactions to Kant, Hume, Hegel, the attempt to show that Africans are capable of that. And you see, for the earliest African philosophers, even in this modern period, the people we can talk about, Wiredu, Omoregbe, and co, those who came in the 70s and 80s, they spent a whole lot of time debating on oral tradition and writing. And so at some point, I have this impression that we got to a certain junction where we felt that we needed to embark on this decolonization project. And as it went by, a number of upcoming scholars found succor in going back into history, into pre-colonial history, to find African variants for almost all concepts that you find in contemporary philosophical discourse. And so what was supposed to be an epoch has now become an enduring tradition, such that today, when an issue comes up, when a particular issue gains currency in philosophical discourse, the default mode is for us to want to find what the African variant is. It is as if we feel that unless we have an African version of a particular theory, then we are not capable. There is this constant attempt to justify ourselves, to show that we are also involved, to show that our forefathers foresaw this issue, they had a say on it, and it is our own responsibility as contemporary scholars not to bring anything new really to the table, but to unearth that which colonialism has tried to bury. That, I think, is one major problem that has affected the way and manner in which we have approached scholarship in the humanities in Africa, and especially African philosophy. And you can add that to the way and manner in which our universities are also structured. In many African universities, you hardly find people who are dedicated to certain projects. People who can say, okay, this is a consistent line of thought. This is a consistent body of work. Because our university systems are actually built about writing papers, getting published, so people have the penchant to tend to drift from one idea to the other. And then you now see that the very few people who engage on substantive projects are people who, in most cases, attract funding from foreign organizations. And these foreign organizations, in their own limited understanding of decoloniality, are establishing African institutes, for instance, as you see all over the United States. They want you to come and present African versions of a certain theory, and they feel that by doing that, they are giving you a voice. And so when you develop a research project, it is often to suit the demands and the desires of those who are in Western institutions who are funding such projects. So it seems at some point there was this feeling that, oh, for me to sound as if I'm saying something new, I have to go back to pre-colonial thought. I have to make it look like ethno-philosophy. That the African voice has been marginalized into the discourse. And so what we see is this unending penchant of going back to look for the faintest of ideas.
I think we've lost Dr. Yekon. I'll try to get him back. Okay, while we wait for Dr. Oyekon to join us again, I can see that there are some questions in the group chat area. So I would like, and they are mostly channeled to Dimple. So I would like Augustine Farinola, if you can hear me, to please ask the question he's asking here so Dimple can respond before Dr. Oyekon comes back.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Back. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, network issues. So I was saying that you see scholars in Africa, contemporary scholars in Africa today are also constrained by issues of, where do I get published and what kind of ideas are acceptable in this particular journal. And so where you find a situation in which we have very limited opportunities for people to come up with novel ideas, there is a tendency to want to align to what is already established. People are more or less straitjacketed to restrict themselves to issues that are trending, so to speak, in Western scholarship and in which journal editors are interested. And so the implication of that for me is that we have not been able to develop substantially what we can refer to as indigenous but modern knowledge systems in African philosophy. So, our idea of indigenous knowledge is limited to that which is pre-colonial. And we feel that because that is what gains currency, that is what looks new, that is what sometimes attracts the kind of funding that we seek. It is more alluring. It is more enticing for us as scholars to continue the unending task of excavating, so to speak, buried answers to present and future questions of existence in Africa and across the globe. And I think that it has led to a situation in which we have now overstretched, in some cases, the case we are making for pre-colonial African philosophy. So so if you ask me to sum up, I will say that the reason why I think we have not had much of indigenous contemporary or modern knowledge production in the humanities in Africa and in philosophy specifically is because we are still stuck in the mindset that there is a need for us to continuously speak for the existence of African philosophy, although it is overflowed, but we have found creative ways to continue to adapt and adopt it into numerous ideas that come up. Talk about terrorism, talk about bioethics. We always find one African scholar or the other who is talking about an African variant, and talk about environmental issues in Africa, the despoliation in the Niger Delta. You find somebody who is talking about a Yoruba or a Cameroonian approach to environmental management and environmental ethics and all of those things. So it always seems that we have this default mindset to resort back to that kind of approach. Now, the other thing, which I have also mentioned, is the way and manner in which research projects are designed from by institutions that are external to Africa. So when they are not solving our problems, they are not addressing our problems, but they are making funds available and they are trying to tap from our know-how. And so we are constrained here in Africa to, most of the time, design our research projects to suit the demands of institutions outside of Africa instead of addressing our own issues. And then the other one has to do with public access to publication. We need, I think, the absence of platforms for the few ones who are attempting to break this barrier to set this new trend of generating modern yet indigenous African ideas. The platforms are very limited. Although, yes, there is a wider question of, how African can your idea be if you are thinking from a post-colonial point of view, given that the university context, the institutional context from which you are doing your philosophy, from which you are theorizing, is already an admixture of African culture and Western culture. But I think that argument is not a very strong one. Those who hold that position, that we cannot do what we call authentic yet modern indigenous African philosophy, they miss the whole point of what culture is all about, in my view. I believe that culture evolves, and at the moment, what we can call contemporary African culture is one that is a blend of Africa's pre-colonial norms, values, worldviews with the Western, as well as the Asian world, that have combined to, in a globalized world, exert so much influence on the way we think and on the way we perceive, the world. So if we see ourselves as a people of different cultures, now we have a hybrid of cultures that is still unfolding in a way, but we can say that culture itself has an identity. We can describe it, that it is a mixture of, it's an eclectic outlook that we have of our culture. We will understand that it is precisely from that standpoint that we need to begin to do African philosophy in a way that will address the existential questions with which Africa is faced at the moment. Maybe I should stop there for now, and then we'll respond to questions as time goes on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adeolu, for that exhaustive answer. I have my own questions for each of our panelists, but let's start with Augustine Farinola, who appears to have questions for both Dimpo and Dr. Oyekon. And then thereafter, I can allow panelists to also discuss and ask questions about what they've discussed. Yeah, so Augustine Farinola, if you could just turn on your video and ask your questions.
Thank you very much, Ariba. And thanks so much, Dr. Oyekon, and also Dimpo. My question and concern with Dimpo's presentation, which is a very good presentation, bringing awareness to the issue of gender in African philosophical discourse. Mine is some things are very good, some advocacies and some ideology, like the idea of gender in African philosophy, but it looks more or less like in carrying a framework that maybe some of the discourse that is taking place elsewhere into a discussion that is going on somewhere else. Because for me as a person, I would say that philosophy itself, idea, which deals with ideas and thinking, has no, what we can say, a gender-based ideal is an idea. And the whole thing with whether women are being raped or women are not given positions in Africa, or whether women are being subjugated in educational discourse. Hi, everybody. It's something that I feel to a great extent that is not an African it's not an African issue. It's more or less like trying to bring up something that is not, because when it comes to some of all these things, they have been addressed in ethics. We have African philosophers like late Professor Sophie Oluwole, and we have a lot of students in Africa and lecturers in African philosophy. So I feel that you need to take a look at that idea of, because I'm being in the West, I know that when you start talking about Black people or Africans, they start bringing some things about equating this equality thing with maybe gender, or bring some women to come and say, oh, we are not also giving voice if you start talking about Africa. So we're talking about African philosophy, then we're coming up, women are not recognized in African philosophy. Then it will come to a point to be handicaps are not recognized in African philosophy. It's come to a point to be, and it will disrupt the whole entire framework. So I just feel, and then my question is to Dr. Oyekon, is to look at the effort that has been made, which you acknowledge, by past African philosophers, which many people have made a lot of, mention their names, and which is more or less like trying to do some kind of looking for African equivalents of concepts, or philosophical concept, person, or epistemological concept, and all these things. And I feel that as a good cause, in order to avoid fallacy of equivocation, because when we jump into a discussion with other parts of the world in which they're evaluating their ideas and worldview, and we just start talking without checking and looking at those concepts, are they comparable? Do they have the same meaning? Do they serve the same purpose in our worldview? We were going to fall into talking upside down. And that was the same thing anthropologists did. and looking at our worldview and looking at our philosophy, they turn it upside down. So I feel that it may not really be that we have started working on a massive level in African philosophy, but I feel that maybe what you have said is true, that the idea of conceptual analysis, the idea of looking for equivalence is a good direction. That seems to be what should continue in African philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustine, for your question. Dimple, or you can, if you could respond. Dimple first.
Thank you, Augustine, for your questions and comments that you make. They're actually quite thought-provoking. And I think I'll just first start with addressing your issue of equivocation. I know that was not directed to me, but I think, you know, a lot of times African philosophy engages itself in this project of, you know, equating certain, you know, concepts and conceptualization as a project of African philosophy, so much to the extent where we end up we're basically just working within a westernized framework, right? Where we're trying to find an equivalent of something within an African context, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose. When in fact, or it almost kind of moves from the assumption that a certain understanding in the West needs to be found, you know, in an African context. Whether it exists or it does not exist seems to be the actual main focus, when in fact we could just deconstruct these frameworks or work, you know, from the context or position in which we are in. But let me just address your concerns on the notion or the issue of gender. I mean, if we take Oyeshile's working definition in his 2008 publication of defining African philosophy, and I think if we work with this definition of African philosophy, he actually defines it as, he says, African philosophy involves the critical and logical examination of the experience of African people whilst reflecting on the issues that are important to their needs and ways of life. So if we're going to be talking about an issue of gender equality, or if we occupy ourselves with a pre-colonial project, neglecting the fact that we actually exist in a post-colonial world, then it means the kind of philosophy or work that we're doing seems to not, you know, reflect on the actual realities that people are facing in a post-colonial reality, right? So it's one thing, we cannot really be oblivious to the fact that African women are facing certain problems and challenges in Africa in particular. And it's not an issue of just, it could be an issue of transposing or transferring some of the concepts or conceptualizations that come from either the West or in African America or whatever the case is. And one that could be owed to the fact that we have inherited a very gendered hierarchy, you know, coming from a colonial, whether we have or have not, but we find ourselves with this problem in a post-colonial context. And I think the kinds of philosophies that, you know, speaking to what Dr. Oyekan was talking about, the kind of philosophies that we construct now, or the kinds of engagements that we you know, kind of engage in at this present moment, it needs to be engagements that actually responds to the lived realities or the current realities that African people are facing. And there was a question about whether, part of your question was whether, you know, I think you were asking whether Western philosophy has done better. I don't think Western philosophy has done any good for African women in particular, or for African people in general. I don't think Western philosophy, we find ourselves in this problem because of much of the work that was done by white anthropologists and sociologists in colonial times, where they were actually misconceptualizing many of, you know, the ideas, many of the traditions, many of the practices of African people. And I think it really is an agenda of African philosophy to work on the reconceptualization of of these ideas, of these practices, and seeing whether there's perhaps a relevance of them in a post-colonial context, or, and just trying to make sense of them now. Many of these pre-colonial ideas and notions that we've engaged ourselves in, some of them, to some extent, it's very difficult for us to make sense of them now because we're working within a very westernized post-colonial framework, right? But there's still that necessity where we actually engage with the necessity, of these post-colonial, or some of the post-colonial work that has been done, but also the relevance of these, of the work that is being done with the post-colonial, work. And it's necessary. If we talk about issues of gender, saying that philosophy is philosophy and all of that, one, we had a problem with Immanuel Kant's philosophy because it was actually very, he was a racist one. Many of them were racist. And you actually come to realize that even the conceptions of human dignity, for instance, that they were coming up with were actually conceptions that were not catered for African people. So we need to fix these things if the conceptualizations of certain notions, certain practices, ideas, and terms are exclusive of certain groups of people, whether they're ableist, whether they are anti-women, whether they are anti-African. And I think it's really the project of African philosophy to try and engage with those very important issues.
Thank you so much, Dimpo, for your answer. I'll ask Dr. Oyekon to also respond to Farinola, but I also request, if you're asking questions, please be brief with your questions. You can ask your questions in about a minute. And also responses should also be a bit brief because we actually have about 30 minutes left, exactly, or rather 29 minutes left. So let's try to have everyone's, as many people as can participate, talk. So Dr. Oyekon, if you can respond to Marinola.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Austin. I think Dimple tried to actually take your two questions at a stride. So what I'll just do is to re-emphasize the point that has been made. We must acknowledge the important historical role of the pioneers of African philosophy. No doubt there was a need to respond to that erroneous assumption that Africans did not know how to think prior to our contact and prior to Africa's contact with Europe. But having done that, it is not a project we need to engage in or that we need to prioritize ad infinitum. There is a need for us to now shift and begin to use philosophy in Africa to address contemporary problems in Africa. And so I do not think we do African philosophy much favor when we hack back at every opportunity to ideas already embedded supposedly in the worldviews of our forefathers, or of our forebears. So if we think that all the answers to questions like terrorism, ethnic clashes, environmental degradation, sexual inequality have already been provided for by certain concepts in pre-colonial African thought, where we will be running into some epistemological and even practical errors. Because what we will be saying in essence is that first and foremost, these people who lived in pre-colonial Africa already foresaw all the problems, all the challenges that the continent could face, and so they already developed in advance ideas to counter them. And the converse of that is that we that live in post-colonial Africa are practically handicapped. We do not have ideas of our own in this contemporary time that can address some of these challenges. And so what we need to do is to go and dig up that which exists, but which was not documented, however, which has been embedded in our in our oral history. So what we need to do, in my view, is to come to that realization that knowledge progresses incrementally, and that there is a phase that we had, that phase where we needed to make a case for the agency of the African person prior to his or her contact with the colonialists. But there is now a need for us to move to that next level, where we simply begin to use contemporary ideas to respond to contemporary African problems. I will just say on a last note that, Dimple has touched on a question that has to do with the reason why we do not have sufficient response to issues arising from gender studies in philosophy. I agree with that in totality, but I also think that it's a problem that is not peculiarly African. I think if you see these discussions going on in several chat rooms in the West as well, as to how women are still marginalized, and I do not think it helps us for us to deny the fact that women do not have that sufficient place that they ought to have in the academia, but it's more of a cultural thing. And it's also a culture that is not limited, it's a cultural attitude that is also not limited to Africa. It's the problem of patriarchy generally, and I do not think it's particular to African philosophy, to Africa as a continent, but I also think that it's a pervasive problem that we find in the academia and other spheres of life, and we cannot afford not to be a part of that conversation just because we do not want to be seen, to be aping in quotes what is going on in the West. The agitation is louder in the West, but it is worthy of being pursued here in and of itself. And so that is the way I see it.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Yekon. Dr. Richmond, I know you're itching to weigh in on the discussions. So I'll just let you speak. But before you do, I actually have a question I want to insert before you go on with your discussion. So in African philosophy, especially Anglophone African philosophy, there is a disconnect with the Francophone side of things, for obviously mainly because of the language barriers. But it seems beyond that, there is an unwillingness to, or there's a seeming unwillingness to discuss with philosophers from that part of from those parts of Africa. I mean, apart from Pauline Hotunji, who also writes in English, I don't think there is a real exhaustive conversations with philosophers from the Francophone side of things. And of course, philosophers from North Africa, philosophers from, in a way, East Africa, are also often left out of the conversations, even Central African philosophers. Do you think there's anything we can do to bridge this gap, if at all there is a gap to be bridged? You can answer that as you react to other discussions. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that we'll all agree that philosophy, when we take out the African from philosophy, philosophy itself is a way of analyzing issues, and it trades on universal principles and critical engagement with issues. So if the theoretical underpinnings and the theoretical principles under which you are philosophizing is something that can stand the test of universal validity, then there shouldn't be any barrier to engaging with African philosophers in other parts of the world. So when someone is in an English-speaking country philosophizing, and someone else is in a Francophone country, I guess the theoretical underpinnings will be the same, and the methodology and probably the content of the issues that they will be discussing will all be the same. So if we grant that, we are philosophizing, then there shouldn't be a way in which we can't engage. So of course, if we can translate into the terms that we would understand, having, embodying the same analytical principles, that engagement will flourish. So yes, there seems to be that disconnect because of the linguistic barrier. But I think that so long as we are looking to theorizing on issues affecting Africa, and we also embodying or using the same theoretical principles, that disconnect can easily be bridged. So if we can get people who are well versed in both languages and can translate into English or into French, then we can really have that kind of conversation ongoing. So yes, linguistic barrier, but linguistic barrier is not something that we can surmount. And once we can translate it, we can still engage in that discourse because they embody the same philosophical or theoretical principle that underlie them. The other issue that I wanted to engage, so if I understand from Dimple and from our discussions, I think that yes, we can admit that it is not that Africans are discriminating against women or anything, but I guess the issue here is philosophical engagements with gender and sexuality. So how were we engaging with those issues? And it's true that yes, we can look at the project of trying to defend the existence of Africa. But issues like race and gender are issues affecting Africans now. But when I look at Ghana, right, the issue of race is not really a big issue. So I can understand how, for instance, Radio NJT probably did not focus so much on race because that wasn't really a pertinent issue of Ghanaians, so to say, unlike, say, those in South Africa. In the same way, we should also not forget that there are also the legal aspects to it. So, for instance, in Ghana, where homosexuality is illegal, trying to philosophize or write about that, you have that kind of labeling or tagging. And oftentimes, when I hear Dimple talking, it seems like we are not able to distinguish between the intellectual engagement with these issues versus advocacy, right? So when people try to advocate for instance, or making it legal, or trying to come out with policies that will legitimize some of these issues. Oftentimes you have that backlog, you have that backlash, you have that obstacles there because of the legal frameworks and the policies that are not necessarily philosophical or based on any philosophy, but those are stumbling blocks to trying to engage in those discussions. And yet we can create that safe space, that kind of non-judgmental intellectual space within journals and within that kind of philosophical discussion. So we can have that disconnection. And I think that for contemporary African philosophers, we engage in more of these intellectual discussions without necessarily linking that to policy. And so we can engage in discussions on sexuality, gender, and all of that. And yet the policymakers probably have no idea that there's that kind of debate or discussion going on in philosophical circles. And how many philosophers here in Ghana actually, are on boards or are engaged in politics or are engaged in policy making? Probably none. So yes, there's that kind of disconnection between philosophy and our thinking and our debates and that kind of intellectual discourse and the policy makers and the framework or the legal framework that governs us. And if we're able to bridge that gap, if we engage in that kind of social commentaries, if we engage in the fact that we don't want the philosophizing to sit within the journals and the conferences, but we want that to have impact on societal issues. And that's the whole point of African philosophy. We're trying to theorize on issues affecting Africa. But beyond that theory, right, how do we take that framework? How do we take that theories to the policymakers? Are we ourselves engaged in the policymaking? Are we ourselves shaping the discourse on the, on the national and societal front, or we are engaging it amongst philosophers? So all of us here are philosophers. We are engaging in these issues. We all understand the importance of engaging in issues relating to gender, sexuality, and all of that. And yet, we don't have many of these policymakers amongst us for us to really impress upon them the kind of issues that we discuss here. The other aspect of it is the fact that we, of course, we don't want to say that let's have that kind of blind return to our traditional concepts and our traditional ideas. Nonetheless, we also have to worry about the question of identity. So the reason why that question is important is that if I try to, I'm not trying to borrow a Western concept into an African concept. I think Rui and others have written extensively on that. And they've tried to show how, even from our own African language and our own linguistic instruments, we can dissolve some of the philosophical debates, like the mind-body problem, which has been, an age-old problem in Western philosophy. It's not really an issue for the Akan because of the way in which we conceptualize the mind and the body. But the point that we need to emphasize is that when I want to make a particular idea African, and I can see why people want to have or to hold on to that kind of traditionalism. So they wouldn't want to, or to have that kind of urge to defend, some ethnic or traditional ideas, or because we feel that those ideas is what makes it African. Right? And so when we, for instance, we want to talk about democracy and all of that, again, when we want to say, well, what is a concept, a democratic concept that is authentic, that can be African? We'll see ourselves going back to certain concepts within our language or certain concepts that were traditionally practiced pre-colonial times. And I think there is nothing really wrong with going back to them, because we're not really going to just appropriate it wholesale. We want to cast those in modern light, but we also want to have certain analytical tools that will, or something framework or contemporary framework that will make them suitable to contemporary societies. And nonetheless, there will still be something that was pre-colonial. And so the point is, because we want to have, or because we are obsessed with the question of trying to make it African. So if we're trying to make it African, then obviously it has to have some roots within the language that we speak as Africans, or within the ideas that we engage with pre-colonial time, or what we want to say traditional times. And so because that question of identity, that question of characterizing something, an idea as being African, seems to be very important to us. And that's how come we are not able to move forward into trying new terrains or new ideas, because we feel like when I come with a new idea now, how would we characterize that idea as African? Well, obviously, you might say it is African either because the one proposing it is an African, or because that issue is pertinent to a particular issue pertaining to Africa, right? And so it wouldn't gain much currency as opposed to something that I take from, pre-colonial time that was being practiced before colonialism, colonialism, or something that is inherent in our language, which makes it authentically African. And then I try to cast those in modern life. So I would want, or I would go for those traditional concepts in trying to reshape them into modern jackets. But at the same time, we wouldn't also want to be just too anachronistic and trying to just appropriate whatever is there, because as I said, we're more interested in the question of identity. What is it that makes it African? And I'm sure that we've been engaging with that issue, not only in defending African philosophy as a branch of philosophy, but I think that the future of African philosophy ought to be linked to the future of philosophy itself. And as we are aware, philosophy itself is under threat in most universities now. And here at the University of Ghana, as you might be aware, is the Department of Philosophy and Classics. And we had to merge the two departments where we initially had Department of Philosophy and Department of Classics. But as time goes on, there were not many staff. Most students were not choosing, or because people are more interested in the job market. What will philosophy do for you and all of that? So in order not to collapse the two departments, why don't we join the two departments to form the Department of Philosophy and Classics? So you have a stronger staff strength and all of that. But that is still, that still threatens the department, because even those who come into the department, when you try to coerce them into doing classics, they feel like, well, if I read Socrates and Plato and all of that, what am I going to do with my life? And so, so philosophy is being threatened. And so the future of African philosophy ought to be linked to the future of philosophy itself. And how are we going to embrace the theoretical principles, the critical engagements of issues going forward? And as I said in the beginning, I think that the first generation of the Radios and the Menkichis, and maybe the second generation with the Matolinos and Chimakonam and the rest, the third generation is the Arabia, me, Dimpo, we the young ones. How are we trying to, forge a niche, try to carve something that is very unique and that will propel the whole discourse into a different terrain of another generation? Those were some of the interventions I wanted to make.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond, for that exhaustive discussion. We have some questions here. So what I'm going to do, if you have a question, just raise your hand. There's a raise your hand function here. You can click on it. But what we are going to do now is to take this quite quickly. We can take this quite quickly. I would give 30 seconds to at least 4 or 5 speakers who would then ask their questions, and then the panelists will very briefly respond. I can see that someone whose name who is listed as Infinix Note 5 has a question. Victor Nweke has a question. Bjorn Freta has a question. So we will just ask these questions very quickly, 30 seconds, and then the panelists can respond in maybe a minute, so we can finish up quickly. So let's start with whoever is Infinix Note 5. If you could please ask your question in like 30 seconds.
Are you sure that Ada had you? I think it should be Ada. You can send him a chat.
Oh, okay. Then let's move on to maybe Victor Nweke. If he's here, he can very quickly ask his question.
Okay, thank you, Arabia. My question, really, I think is a comment and also a question to the panelists generally. First, I want to say that I think we all think from a place, and since we are thinking from a place, I am happy that we are thinking from a space too, presently. I think that's the kind of argument people like Jonathan Chimakonam and Jan have in 2015. So I am surprised that we should be still talking of pre-colonial, post-colonial. All of us were born, I think everybody here was born in the post-colonial Africa.
No, not everybody.
Yeah, I said again. Okay, yeah, sorry, sir.
No.
Yeah, I think if we should be looking at it from that perspective, and my question go to Kwesi, how could someone describe you? So I be saying, I am asking that also relative to the question Wuredu refused to answer when he was asked, are you an analytic philosopher from Africa, or are you an African philosopher? And he dodged it by saying, what do you mean? So from that perspective, how do we describe the present generation of African philosophers? Do we describe them, do we define them, add them from the trajectory of thoughts they are following, or do we describe them or classify them on their country, their nationality? So how do we now begin to classify schools of thought within African philosophy, given the generations that have passed? That's the question I have for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, any of our panelists willing to tackle that question very, very, very briefly?
Hey, why don't you take all the questions? Why don't you take all the questions? Moderator, let's take all the questions.
Okay, if that will make things faster.
Yeah.
Beyond on Infinix Note 5, I see your back. So please, could you very, very briefly ask your question?
Me now or Infinity?
Infinix is not speaking.
Okay.
Okay, so Beyond, you can go. Beyond, you can go.
I just want to make a quick comment, especially on what Dimfo said, which was very interesting to me. I think that it is indeed dangerous to find equivalents to Western concepts. And that is mostly because Western philosophy cannot function as an example for philosophy per se, because Western philosophy is highly elitist. Western philosophy is not only ignorant and applying colonial violence towards African philosophy. Western philosophy is even elitist from within its own participants. So if you look into a Western history of philosophy, you usually find completely ignored everything that is not gender binary, everything that is female, everything that comes from, it's completely ignoring disabled people. So I think it's very dangerous if one wants to take a Western concept seriously, Africanize it, or use it within an African context. I think we always have to understand that these Western concepts were already ignorant within their very own Western framework. So I completely agree with what Dimfo said. As long as Western philosophy does not manage, as I like to call it, to de-superhumanize itself, it will continue to be an elitist project. It will not be a project for everyone. And from what I learned as an outsider of African philosophy, that seems to be very far away from the African approach, which is, from my point of view, a much more exclusive approach to philosophy. So Western philosophy has a lot of work to do to open up the project of philosophy to literally all human beings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bjorn. I think Professor Loki Karusi wants to ask a question. If you could very briefly ask, then Elokai, Chuko Elokai, I think you also have a question. If you can also briefly ask after Professor Loki. And I think those are the two we can take given the time now. So let's quickly ask our questions so our panelists can respond. Professor Loki.
My question goes to Dimpo. We talk of African philosophy, so also too we talk of African feminism. Do feminists in Africa only think of just theorizing without gravitating towards the practicality of their theories? Let me give an example. I don't know, there's this concept, not just concept, phenomenon in the marriage concept in Africa, the issue of bride wealth, or bride price, the way you call it. In my estimation, bride price or bride wealth amount to commodification and deification of womanhood. Let's take it clearly that androcentrism, that's patriarchy, is global. The fact that a woman marries a man, you change your name to that of the man, to the husband, or let me say the man, is indicative of the global nature of androcentrism. So what I'm trying to ask from Dimpo, the women in Africa that are feminists, to what extent are they serious with in terms of practicalizing the ideals of feminism? Taking the case of bride wealth or bride price as a classical example. In my case, this weekend, I have an engagement, family engagement, where I have to preside over a marriage, and the issue of bride price and bride wealth comes up. So, Dimpo, How far are women in Africa trying to get themselves liberated from the clutches of traditions and culture that are oppressive to them? Thank you very much. Weke is smiling. He knows what I'm saying.
Thank you, Professor Lucky. Chukwueluka Odwagu, could you please very briefly ask your questions?
Thank you very much for this wonderful and interesting conversation. I just have two questions, and it's a general question and straight to the point. Well, feminism, I want to ask if feminism is an Western construct or an African construct. That is one. Secondly, is it necessary for us to have an African version of an idea that exists in the Western idea too? Is it necessary? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eluka. I'll take one more comment from Emmanuel Ofuasia. I see you want to comment to all the panelists, so please do that very briefly. We already
all right. All right then. Okay. Thank you very much. Once again, I congratulate all the panelists for a good job, and they have given a very good talk regarding the state of scholarship in contemporary African philosophy. But I actually want to point out some problems that I think we have. One of these problems is that we do not read one another. Let us forget about the first generation set of African scholars like Ridu, like Otonji, like all others, okay? In recent times, we have not read one another. And so to talk about African feminism, to talk about how to move forward, it is important that we build a system by engaging one another. Out of many of us on this platform, some of us have not even read the works of one another or each other here. And we are talking about how African philosophy can move forward when we are not engaging one another. I think that is a job we need to fix. That is number one. The second thing that we need to do, as a matter of fact, is that we cannot deny the African past. And we cannot also deny the Western presence. So there is the need to make a blend between the African and the Western. However, it must be mediated by an African logic to make sense. Otherwise, there will be no originality in African scholarship. And there is no way that we can say this is actually something that is African in nature. So African ideas and Western ideas cannot be totally jettisoned. They might have to be mediated and examined from an African logical perspective. And that is the only reason why we will not be queried and mocked for copycatism. I think this is a take home for everyone that is here. We need to engage one another. We need to read one another and build a system. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ofoasia. So I'll ask our panelists to quickly respond to the questions that are related to them. I'll ask them to be as brief as possible and also include their final words in their responses, so we can close as quickly as possible. We're already on borrowed time, like I said earlier. So, Dimpo, if you could start off your final response.
Just the first question about classification. I think, again, this is another borrowed westernized way of thinking, right? Where we think everything has to be, either or, analytic or continental, Western or African, that kind of a thing. So if I was, asked the question that we read was asked, I was probably just going to say I'm just an African philosopher, or I'm I try to be a practical African philosopher, right? Wherein I try to deal with issues that affect Africans in this day and age, in this present day and age, and try to see and find ways in which we can try and restore the humanity and human dignity that has been lost of Africans throughout, throughout history. So to Professor Lucky's question about bride price and just talking about, the practicalities, and this would speak to Chukwueloka's question, about appropriating, some of these conceptualizations that come from the West, or ideologies and theories that come from the West. I think much of the work in African feminism, particularly in Africa, has been engaged in advocacy, you know, so a lot of the work is literally down the alley of activism. And what we really need is and intellectual engagement and theorizing of issues that affect, you know, African people, issues of gender and sexuality in particular. So we lack much of that. So, and I think that is why my, you know, part of my talk was really just about raising awareness and cautioning, you know, the need for this work to actually be done, because again, it runs us into a problem where people who are actually doing the activism work on the ground are actually left with no resource, you know, intellectual resources to use from an African context that they can actually use to resolve problems that are faced by African people on the ground. So they actually find themselves, you know, with an issue which Chukwueloka was raising earlier about ending up appropriating some of, you know, ideologies and theories from the West. So most of African feminists or African people working within the space of gender and sexuality, some of them do not want to be classified as African feminists, and mainly because of the history of, you know, the theory itself and where it comes from. And that's, you know, that's actually valid. And some people actually, you know, kind of classify themselves as feminists, given the actual general understanding of what feminism is all about. So that's, I think for me, that's neither here nor there, whether you call yourself a feminist or not. But I mean, the work of gender and sexuality needs to be done. So we find ourselves in a situation where we actually have to do the actual intellectual work, you know, of theorizing and coming up with these ideologies. Some of the work has actually begun, you know, in anthropology, when you look at the work of Amadiyume, in sociology, when you look at the work of Oyewumi, and in philosophy, when you look at the work of Kirunzeku, for instance, you know, so she's really trying to actually do some of the intellectual work. It was really a struggle for me when I was doing my honors, and for both my honors and my masters, because I really struggled. There was literally no work in philosophy that I could use, you know, to work on gender and sexuality, basically. So I literally had to find myself borrowing from history, from anthropology, from sociology, and to try and philosophize that work into, you know, and put it into philosophy. So a lot of the intellectual work needs to be done. We need to start conceptualizing these ideas, these practices, these notions of bride price, the relevance of it, the practicality of it, the Africanity of it, and whether in this day and age is it still even necessary, and it's still even relevant. Those are the conversations that that we need to have. So just my closing words, I concur with what Emmanuel was saying earlier about actually starting to do, we need to start doing this kind of work, you know, where these kinds of platforms are actually, and I think thank you to COVID-19, we find ourselves actually, you know, in a situation where such engagements are actually possible, where virtual engagements or engaging, you know, across the continent is actually not an issue anymore, where we can actually just meet up on Zoom and have these conversations because it's actually necessary. So we need to familiarize ourselves with the work that is actually being done in the continent and start, you know, using and thinking from our particular contexts and positions.
Thank you so much, Dimpo. Thank you so much, Dimpo. Dr. Richmond, if you could respond to the questions and then give us your final word.
I'm not sure I got a particular question to me, but I wanted to reiterate what you said, and I think that was my initial submission, that even if we grant that there was some sort of demise or lack of engagement in African philosophy, we can say, well, that is true of the what are we this generation or this young philosophers and upcoming ones? What are we doing to bridge that gap? What are we doing to have that engagement? So I will also add to what Jima said, and maybe go ahead with what Dave also said, to propose to Arabia and to the organizers to try to maintain the contacts of those who are on this platform, and if possible, to create that kind of network that we all need so that we can start engaging with each other. And most of us work in different aspects of African philosophy. So it will be very interesting to have, to start a platform using the contacts or using the participants on this Zoom and to try to have that kind of engagement. So even if there is or there seems to be a demise of discourse, at least we can resurrect it by from this participants. So that would be my final way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond. We really do hope to resurrect the discourse. Dr. Oyekon, your final word and response to the question.
All I will say here is to commend the organizers. You have raised very, very serious issues, and I'm hoping that we will be able to leverage on this to begin to create the kind of platforms that will help us, first and foremost, to engage with ourselves, and then beyond that, to focus specifically on contemporary issues affecting the large numbers of Africans who are facing serious challenges, and then who look for theoretical articulations of of their agonies and their situations. And so we need to create the platforms not only for engagement with ourselves, but also to bridge the gap between policy and theorizing, so that we can also begin to see some of these ideas coming to fruition. And so I hope that we will explore the possibilities of conferences, platforms for publications in a way that will ensure that we come up with modern indigenous African ideas that can address contemporary problems in Africa. There are numerous challenges outside the academia that we may not be able to go into here, but I think that if we begin to make the effort, we will be able to make some progress a few years down the line.
Thank you so much, Oyekon. I think we are gradually coming to the end of today's event, but before we go, I'll give our host, Dr. Christiana Edika, a chance to have a final word. So maybe in like 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and then I'll close. Thank you.
Can I suggest something? So I've seen a lot of comments in the chat, but it's, once Zoom ends, you don't see those comments. So if the organizers can, I think when it's ended, you can get all the chats as like a file, and then you can also send it to us. So some of them, there was some interesting comment, but it's difficult to read through, and once Zoom is ended, I wouldn't have access to them. So if you can just email them to us, that would be very helpful.
Okay.
That's a good suggestion, please. A very good suggestion.
I'll try to do that just now. Okay, so Dr. Christiana, your final word.
Okay, I want to thank the panelists and the speakers and all those who made comments and questions. For me, it's so engaging and thought-provoking, actually. And I will begin with the last comment made by Emmanuel, that we don't actually read others. I joined this group not up to 1 year now, and I thank some of them who find time to send me papers. I try to read. And because of that, I will comment on the info, whether you've read Genism from Mary Pauline Ebo of Nigeria. She's a professor of philosophy. She wrote something on Genism, and she wrote Genism because she was trying to avoid Western concepts. She's also trying to engage with the content of the whole question of gender equality. And we need to also, in my course on global feminism, I was criticizing some of these qualifications. You bring out feminism, you bring out philosophy, you bring out ethics, and you start qualifying them from where they are coming from. So we run the risk of thinking that when we call it Western philosophy and call it African philosophy, then something is not right somewhere. Yesterday, one of my colleagues in the office was expecting me to defend African ethics. And I told him that I shouldn't be defending African ethics. You are the one to tell me why I should defend an African ethics. So that I am only, if ethics is about how humans should act, I'm here to tell you in a world where we think we are connected. So I am here to talk about how we should act in such a world. So if the question of ethics is how should humans act, so it means that in different cultural contexts, people find a way to act. And those action is now what you bring onto the discourse to critically look at them, and now you can evaluate them. You can advance them using, what Jonathan called interrogative. And the next point I will want to make is the whole idea of heteronormativity. Now, we also have problem with that concept because that means the normativity or heterogeneity. So if we think that we need to criticize the normativity of heterogeneity, are we also saying at the same time we need to accept the normativity of homogeneity? Then homogeneity means that we are all the same. We run the risk of also trying to homogenize everybody. So some of these words, actually I am into always conceptual, I try to watch concepts when people use them. So heteronormativity and homonormativity. How do we find a balance? Trying to avoid this binary way of seeing the world, dual way of seeing the world. Thirdly, we live in a globalized world. Knowledge is also globalized. There is no knowledge that is pure, even in the Western thinking process where I am now working. You read some works that some people are writing today. You see the wave and the interventions of other mindsets. So if they ignore an African way of thinking, they did it intentionally. And that is what I call invisibility. Because you see them playing with Indian perspective, you see them playing with Chinese ideas coming into their discourses in the modern time. But they try to sidetrack Africa, of course, because of that historical relationship we have with them. Africanity and authenticity is another thing that is also very powerful in our discussion today. When we use the word Africa, we should also be aware that there are 4 things that is there, 4 things that is present. 1 is the epistemic understanding of Africa. 2 is the geological understanding of Africa. 3 is the geographical understanding of Africa. 4 is the racial understanding of Africa. So that most of our discourses, when we say African, we also run into this. I think it's something we need to also discuss very often to be able to break away from this whole struggle to justify our existence, our rationality, and actually start engaging. And I think that is what conversational philosophy is all about, to start engaging and no longer trying to please someone, prove something to some people, whether they care about it or not, is, for me, it's just useless, okay? But the moment we start producing, like many of us are producing, people will be forced to look into it. Without us, all we need to do, like, again, the final comment, that we need to read each other. And for that, I will go now to the final comments of the presenters. And one of those points is the need for us to continue this conversation on this platform. And in collaboration, in association with what Emmanuel Ofoasia said, and what has been happening in the Conversational Philosophy Forum, I would suggest, if it is possible, for us to have this type of environment where, as scholars, we take text written by people, either individuals, we choose a text, read it and present it here, and we discuss it. Maybe 3 texts for 3 people, depending on time, or 1 person at a time, but 1 person will be so small for a whole day. So we can have 2 texts, 2 people, not their own text, not their book, not their idea, the idea of another among us here, and summarize it, send it to us to read, and we can discuss it. I have a license to this Zoom, so I can always afford to host it all the time. I know that people from other areas, you pay for data, you pay for light, you pay for all that. That would be so tasking. But I think it is something that is worth doing. If we be able to do that, it will help some of us to read our texts, the books, articles that we have written, at least on that note. Once more, thank you, Dimfo, thank you, Oyekan, thank you, Richmond, and thank you, Arabia. And thanks to the administrators of CSP for this opportunity given to me to host this occasion. And all the participants, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Christiana. On my part, I'd like to thank our panelists for agreeing to be a part of this discussion. I'd like to also especially thank Adielu Oyekon, who came in at very short notice to stand in for or to replace Dr. Molefe, Motsamai Molefe, who couldn't attend because he had other pressing issues to attend to at this particular time. I'd like to thank the elements of the CSP for organizing events for the UNESCO World Philosophy Day. It's been a tradition. I'd like to thank the convener, Dr. Chimakonam, for the idea for this event. I'd like to thank everyone that took out time and data and many other things to this program. Thank you so much. We've also listened to some of your suggestions. We'll work on it. At the end of this event, I will just email you the chats. I email everyone the chats. If you don't have the chat, I can send you my email. You can let me know, and then I'll send it to you, so that everyone has an idea of the comments and the questions that have been asked, and maybe respond privately to individuals who've asked these questions. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending this event. It's been a good discussion. Wish we could go on forever, but we have to go. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Arabia. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Victor, can we talk briefly before you go?
Ooh. Okay.
So, did you get somebody else?
Yeah, they just yesterday night, came to the final lesson, but the difference now is date. I don't know if the date will be better for you. The majority of the participants preferred 16th.
16th.
Yeah, because you said 14 will be okay by you. Then Jonathan said 14 or 16 or so.
Let me check. It is
Wednesday, I think.
Wednesday. What time would that be?
It will be midday or just when will, because it's Professor Finos from University of Zimbabwe who have agreed earlier, but he said, okay, that the challenge is that on Monday, as the dean, he has meetings on Monday. But
16th, I mean, 16th should be okay, even though I use it to prepare for my seminars on Thursdays. So, but I will try to prepare my seminars on Thursday, then we can have it. I mean, it's okay. 16th is 16. No. It's like I have something in the school by 3 o'clock. So that means 16th.
We can even have it late in the evening if during the day we'll be busy.
Yeah, I have something by 3 o'clock. That should end at least 5 o'clock or 5:30. Thereabouts. So, but apart from that, the whole of the time is free.
So
if we
do it earlier or do it late?
If you put it 12 o'clock.
Yeah, okay. 12 is okay.
Well, if you put it 12 o'clock, so it doesn't have to be too morning.
Yeah.
Then I could have time. So if you put it 12, that is our 12 here.
Yeah.
At least we have up to 3 o'clock to do whatever. Today it lasted for 2 hours, and I'm sure it will just be about that 2 hours.
Okay, in that case, I will send you the emails.
Okay.
Then.
So fix it for 16th, 12 o'clock.
12 o'clock, okay.
All right.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, good. So hope you're well.
Yeah, I am.
Your project?
It's going very